I'm Indy Nidell, and this is Out of the Trenches, where I sit here in the chair of wisdom and answer all your questions about the First World War. Javier Ignacio Tapia Bromberg writes, "Hey Indian crew, one question. You've talked a lot about the Franco-Prussian War, even the American Civil War, as test beds for the technology and tactics that would eventually clash in World War I. What about the War of the Pacific between Chile, Peru, and Bolivia? I know several European and American military observers accompanied the armies. Did they draw any useful information from this war? Thanks a lot." Okay. In the late 19th century, almost all the Latin American countries were engaged in some sort of military conflict for economic dominance or redrawing borders. Two of the strongest regional powers, Brazil and Argentina, were engaged in a military conflict with Paraguay in 1870. Chile came into conflict with Peru and Bolivia in 1879. Old agreements over borderlines in the Atacama Desert and the control of the local resources, especially sodium nitrate and guano, together with political power trips from the local elites, traditional national rivalries, and imperial ambitions, culminated in what was known as the War of the Pacific. Now, as the name suggests, it was a war about the control of the Pacific coastline that traditionally controlled that part of South America. And it is true, the war itself was fought with more or less modern armies and modern equipment. They had breech-loading rifles from Belgium, steel-barreled cannons from Britain, sabers from France, and even a few Gatling guns. And the war saw the first use of naval torpedoes. So why did the European observers dismiss this war as a lesson for Europe? Well, the thing is, it was mostly a war of armies that were only a few thousand men strong. And while the guard units had the modern equipment, the guys further down the line were still equipped with outdated rifles. The artillery consisted of a few dozen pieces, and the machine guns were maybe a handful in total. So, besides a few bigger clashes, it mostly came down to border raids and skirmishes on land and at sea. The war was also deeply influenced and guided by class and race issues that were specific to South America. So besides the new military equipment, it wasn't that much of a modern war Europe could imagine fighting. Liam Deer writes, Hello again, Liam Deer. I hope you don't mind me asking, but there is one topic I'm intrigued about, which I don't believe you've covered yet. But have you done, or are planning to do, a special episode or an Out of the Trenches about mercenaries during the war? I know I've never heard of mercenaries in the Great War personally, but there must have been mercenaries. They had a presence in every conflict from the days of Alexander to today, although they are called private military companies now, but I digress, okay? So why not the Great War? Keep up the good work, still a big fan. Okay. The definition of what is a mercenary is a bit broad. I mean, if you understand a mercenary purely as a soldier hired by a foreign army to fight for their cause, well, you could say that forces like the Nepalese Gurkhas or the armies drawn from French North Africa fit into that category. But those were technically troops that already belonged to the sphere of influence of the country that recruited them. The term mercenary would really apply to men from a non-belligerent nations, like the Americans serving in the Escadrille Lafayette, the Swedish officer corps that fought for the Central Powers in Persia, the Finnish Jäger Corps, and some other volunteers that wanted to fight for a different country, like some men from neutral countries like Switzerland, Denmark, or the Netherlands. But even those were volunteers and weren't in it primarily for the money. There was little private gain in the First World War, and certainly no way that being a soldier for hire would make you rich. On the contrary, in this war, it was all about the loyalty to the nation and to the cause they were fighting for. A soldier from another nation would be seen as a liability and a risk. The only forces I can think of that really come close to being mercenaries in the traditional sense, in that the war would bring them both money and a better social standing, would be, I guess, the African auxiliaries like the German Askari. Their service on that continent allowed them to rise in their local societies. Serving and fighting for the Europeans gave them a chance for a higher living standard. And African soldiers could afford things like farmland, animals, and even multiple wives. It is a very complex topic, though, and it's not a very well-researched one. Now, feel free to disagree, but besides those native troops, I don't really see any traditional mercenary troops. Oh, but spoiler, so turn it off now. The Great War spawned a new age of mercenaries during the strife of the post-war period. German soldiers banded together as Freikorps. The French Foreign Legion expanded. Finnish and Swedish troops intervened in the Baltic civil wars, and many other nationalities were fighting for the white, red, black, and green armies that were basically fighting all over Eastern Europe, Russia, and Siberia for a couple years there. Hope that helps. Dan Potter writes, I know of Commonwealth war graves, Volksbund, and Memoire des Hommes, but are there any war grave equivalents for the Russians and other nations? Russia had over 3 million dead in that war. They must be buried somewhere. A Google search revealed small numbers of Russians buried in cemeteries scattered across the Eastern Front, and a sad yet fascinating article about forgotten prisoners of the Great War. The enormous casualties of the Russian Empire could not be ignored by the state authority for long, that's true. But the search for a common national narrative really took its time. Tsar Nicholas knew that he had to acknowledge the sacrifice of the dead and give their mourning relatives a place to grieve. So in early 1916, he put official committees in charge of commemoration. He ordered them to build official cemeteries in every larger Russian city and to come up with plans for memorials and monuments. Until then, the Russian war cemeteries were pretty rudimentary, often not much more than mass graves, and even they lacked funding or people to maintain them. Smaller cemeteries and monuments were erected and financed by wealthier families or communities. For example, if a higher officer or the son of a wealthy family was killed. The Tsar knew of the resentment of his people because of the lack of commemoration. And so he planned for expressive statues and monuments which would be understood as symbols of glory and to honor the sacrifice of the Russian people. The Russian Society for Remembrance of the Soldiers Who Fell in the War was founded. And in concert with local authorities, the clergy, rich aristocrats, they began implementing a similar system of localization, information, and reburial that we see in the other European powers. The Tsar's plans involved a huge national cemetery in Moscow and a monument hall of heroes in St. Petersburg. But all those plans and all the projects that were already underway were stopped by the revolutions. For the communists, the war itself was perceived as morally wrong, as an imperialistic war, and they began actively denouncing those that wanted to remember it. Lenin officially decreed the destruction of statues and memorials made under the Tsarist regime. Cemeteries lost their funding, they decayed over time. One day they were simply closed and people were forbidden to enter. The Bolsheviks did not tolerate any sort of even semi-official remembrance of the Great War. And that was the line Communist Russia followed pretty much until its dissolution. History was focused on the Revolution of 1917, and later relied immensely on the Great Patriotic War. The Great War did not fit into the official narrative, so there was no funding for the dead. One exception was the large communities of Russian exiles that roamed Western Europe after the revolution, but they didn't really have a big impact. The official war remembrance nowadays, though, is actually experiencing a revival of reconnection with the Great War, and even building new statues and monuments. If you'd like to see our episode about Russia before the revolution, you can click right here for that. And do not forget to check us out on Instagram and our subreddit, because there's all sorts of cool stuff in both of those places. See you soon.